So my name is John Norris. I'm a criminal defense lawyer practicing in Toronto. I work primarily on criminal cases, but I also do a significant amount of work in connection with free expression. And for a number of years now, I've been a member of the board of CJFE. CJFE does absolutely critical work internationally with IFACs, with the Journalists in Distress program. Our eyes are very often set on places outside of Canada, and rightly so. But at the same time, I'm very proud of the work that CJFE is doing to monitor free expression within Canada, and the very prompt reaction that came from the events on the G20, the very important contacts that were made with journalists who were arrested or detained, the efforts to try to gather information in order to make sensible and well-founded recommendations for the future is a very, very important contribution that CJFE is making and will continue to make. It was very troubling from many different perspectives, and I think that the experience of members of the media was particularly troubling and indeed personally traumatic for many of those individuals. It was apparent that the police did not make appropriate decisions about who to detain, who to arrest, and in fact who to charge. Looked at from their perspective, one has to have a certain amount of sympathy for the decisions that the police had to make in very difficult circumstances. But at the same time, it's apparent that they made some very serious errors, and there was a significant overreaction and use of police powers that were far broader than could be justified in the circumstances. I think that we need to look at it from both sides. From the point of view of journalists who are working in the public interest, covering an event of such worldwide importance, they need to have an understanding of the powers that the police do have in our society. Whether they're being used properly or improperly, the police do have certain powers. And the reality is that in a confrontation with the police, the citizen will lose, at least in the first round. You might be vindicated down the road, but that's cold comfort as you're sitting in the back of a police van. So it's important for the journalists to understand where they stand, particularly today with the proliferation of independent media and people holding themselves out as journalists but with no particular affiliation, because that makes it that much more difficult for the police to understand who is doing what. From the other perspective, the police need to be much more sensitive to the role of the media and to have a better understanding of the singular contribution that journalists make in the public interest to covering events like this. And so even if in the heat of the moment there is an overreaction, it's critical that the police decision-making structure on the scene and within the next couple of hours move quickly in order to sort out the people who perhaps were properly arrested from those who were not. And as I say, you're going to lose in that first confrontation, but if that confrontation can be avoided through a better education on the side of the police and through the journalists making sensible decisions about where to stand and fight and where not to stand and fight, then I think that we can avoid the very troubling things that happened over that weekend. I think that there were sort of two different things that were happening. There was the picking out of individual journalists, such as Colin O'Connor, and we still don't understand why that happened. But the other event that was very troubling was the kettling at, I believe it was Queen and Spadina, where the police, with essentially no notice to anybody, decided to detain a large group of people. And caught up within that group were a number of journalists. And they were unable to leave for a significant period of time, and as I recall, it was in the pouring rain as well. And I would really like to know why the police thought that was an appropriate step to take, particularly when the reports that are coming back are that no one had any advance notice that this was going to happen. I would first of all want to know what he thought went wrong and whether he thought that there were mistakes made and whether there were lessons that could be learned from what happened. I would hope that he would be open to discussion. Certainly he got a lot of praise for how he handled some of the Tamil demonstrations that had happened earlier in the year or late in '09. And rightly so. The events were allowed to unfold. There wasn't the sort of confrontations that we saw here. I think that the really hard question that I'd want to ask him is, how was it that the police lost control so easily over certain pockets of the city where the police presence was virtually non-existent? And that, of course, is what has now become the defining moments of the weekend. And I'd also want to know to what extent there was any sort of training at all of the police to be respectful of civil liberties, not only of the demonstrators, but also of those who were covering the demonstration, namely the journalists. I suspect there wasn't, but I would want to know the answer to that. Certainly the research that CJFE is doing is going to be an important, make an important contribution to that. One of the frustrations that many people are experiencing is that there is no one body that is going to be sitting down and looking at what happened, not just from the point of view of journalists, but more broadly the impact on civil liberties for all members of the community. If there was a public inquiry, we could expect to have some answers to what happened, where various perspectives could be offered and then they could all be drawn together. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. Instead, there's this fragmentation of approaches and very narrow points of view that are being taken. What CJFE can do is to try to weave all of these things together and to try to bring the different pieces together in order to give a broader perspective for the benefit not only of journalists and not only indeed of members of the community, but for the police as well, because I think we can make an important contribution to the education of the police and to help them become more sensitized to the role of the media.